Hello, my name is Fabio Parasecoli, and I am the coordinator of the Food Studies program at the New School in New York City. I'm here to introduce this week's innovator of American cuisine, Edna Lewis. Her work was crucial to make all Americans more familiar with Southern food traditions and dishes, including those created by African Americans. You will hear more about the period in which she was active, her life, and her contributions from the panel of experts that we gathered here at the New School. But to better understand her impact, it is important that we familiarize ourselves with the history and the development of African American food culture in the United States, and particularly in the South, where Mrs. Lewis grew up. Most Africans came to the United States as slaves beginning in the 17th century. They were mainly brought to the US to work in agriculture. However, we must consider the unimaginable hardships endured during the boat voyage to the US, now called the Middle Passage. In addition, Africans experienced devastating losses as a result of being uprooted from their individual tribal and language communities, the places they were familiar with, and the crops and dishes they grew up with. Despite the harshness of their life and work conditions, the slaves' contributions to American, and in particularly Southern, foodways were crucial. For instance, they played a huge role in the introduction of African crops such as black-eyed peas, watermelon, and okra. Okra was also called ochigombo or gingombo in Bantu languages, and the name gumbo is still used for the soupy stews from the Gulf Coast region featuring okra. In certain areas, they also contributed to the development of local agriculture. For instance, slaves from West Africa were particularly expert in the cultivation of rice in marshy conditions along mangrove coasts and river deltas. The slaves transferred many of those agricultural techniques to the rice plantations of the Carolinas, which presented similar environmental situations. In certain areas, depending on the crops and the activities in which they were occupied, slaves were allowed to grow some crops and raise animals near their homes, to integrate the food provided by the owners, and even to make some extra cash by selling some products. Over time, they developed various cuisines that integrated grown products with foraged ones, raised animals with hunted or fished ones. In fact, it is more correct to speak of African American cuisines and culinary traditions in the plural, as they differ widely from area to area of the United States. The food in the low country of Georgia and South Carolina is very different from the Creole dishes of Louisiana and Mississippi, or from the rural traditions of Virginia. Some common elements can be identified, like the use of all parts of animals. Pig ears, trotters, snout, and intestines, often referred to as chitterlings or chitlings, oxtails, and all kinds of offal became the protagonists of many succulent dishes. Chicken was also popular, as it was easy to raise, sell, and cook. The preparation and sale of chicken, especially fried, historically allowed many African Americans to launch their own businesses. African Americans also had a great impact on what first their owners and then their employers ate. Slaves were often in charge of provisions, the kitchen, and the table service. Thomas Jefferson's slave, James Hemings, traveled with him to France, was schooled in French cuisine, and introduced French techniques and dishes to Jefferson's notable guests at his estate of Monticello in Virginia. Ingredients, dishes, and techniques were exchanged between the African American cooks and their owners, creating a common language that constitutes one of the most important elements in American cuisines. Already in the 19th century, cookbooks and hospitality books were authored by African Americans. After the Civil War, the segregation imposed by the Jim Crow laws, which included restaurants and other leisure spaces, reinforced the identity of African American cuisines. Beginning at the turn of the 20th century, millions of African Americans from the rural South moved toward better opportunities in the industrial areas of the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West. Migrants brought with them their specific food habits and traditions, which were very different from those of the black communities in which they often settled, This created at first tensions and misunderstandings. As we will see, these dynamics also affected Edna Lewis's personal history, as she moved from the South to New York City precisely in this period. Many of the newcomers stuck to their culture. Over time, their cuisine came to be known as soul food, an expression that became popular in the 1960s when civil rights movement and the overall political climate led many African Americans to find new pride in their culture and traditions. However, not everybody appreciated the food customs from the South. The most politically engaged segments of the black community, like the Black Panthers, argued that those traditions were the result of centuries of slavery and needed to change. Also, the Nation of Islam harshly condemned the dietary practices of the majority in the black community. It is against this cultural and political background that Edna Lewis developed her own voice and her career as a culinary professional. She was born in 1916 in rural Virginia. When she was 16, her father died and she moved first to Washington, D.C. and then to New York City. After working as a seamstress for several years, in 1949, she was hired as a cook at Cafe Nicholson, the restaurant that became popular with artists and intellectuals. Working with Judith Jones, one of the experts that you will hear in the following videos, in 1972 she wrote the Edna Lewis Cookbook, and in 1976 The Taste of Country Cooking, which is still considered a classic in Southern cuisine. She retired from cooking in the mid-1990s and died at her home in Decatur, Georgia in 2006 at the age of 89.